All right, greetings everyone, and welcome to USDA Rural Development and the University of Kentucky quarterly placemaking webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Jackie Ponte, our Chief Innovation Officer. Jackie, the floor is yours.
Hi, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's here today. As Scott mentioned, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at Rural Development, and we're just happy to have you here. I am excited to share some useful information and resources with those looking to fund placemaking projects and communities and individuals looking to receive funding for placemaking projects. If you attended the May 2023 Placemaking in Small and Rural Communities Conference that the University of Kentucky and USDA hosted, then you heard from multiple placemaking experts and real life examples on how placemaking projects have impacted many rural communities. If you were not able to attend the conference, don't worry, you can still get the content from that conference just by visiting the University of Kentucky's YouTube channel and watch the sessions. You should also visit our Rural America Placemaking Toolkit. The link will be put in the chat for resources to help navigate you through the placemaking process, no matter what stage you're at, even if you're just getting started. It's very easy to use. The links to both resources should be now in your chat for you. Thank you, Dustina. In rural America, having a strong sense of place is embedded in the culture. There's a placemaking can help communities build a plan around that sense of place and highlight the ways that make rural communities beautiful and unique. RD is committed to this concept of placemaking and what it can do for our rural areas. And through our partnership efforts with the University of Kentucky, we have been able to expand access to placemaking resources through the Rural America Placemaking Toolkit and through amazing events like today's webinar and the Placemaking in Small and Rural Communities Conference Series. Today's USDA Rural Development Quarterly Placemaking webinar continues themes from the conference in May, such as Start Small and Just Get Started. We want this to be accessible for everyone. And we want to further explore financing options and networking activities around placemaking by sharing a unique model of funding currently being practiced by the Waymakers Collective. The Waymakers Collective describes themselves as radical grant makers. Love that. And they prioritize racial equity and underrepresentation in grant making in Appalachia, with nearly half of their grants going to BIPOC artists and or BIPOC-led organizations. I'm personally excited to hear from the Waymakers Collective grantee today to talk about their real life experience on how they got started and how their creative placemaking project impacted the community. Also with us today is, of course, our partner in the University of Kentucky. And so we're excited to have them with us. I'm pleased to introduce Melissa Bond of the Community Arts Extension Program. She's the Community Arts Extension Program Leader for the University of Kentucky's CEDIC program. She will moderate today's webinar. And for all of these acronyms that I'm reeling off very quickly, they'll be put in the chat so you'll know what those acronyms mean. Melissa has worked directly with the Waymakers Collective, and she'll be sharing her personal experience with you before we hear from the Waymakers Collective Executive Director Joe Tolbert Jr. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and partner, Melissa. Melissa?
Thank you so much, Jackie. We are so excited to be here today. And this quarterly webinar has been put together directly from the feedback from all of you who attended our conference in the past, saying, you know, we love having this once-a-year conference, but we'd love to keep the conversation going. We'd love to check in more frequently. So having this quarterly webinar series gives us the opportunity to do just that. And as you're building your placemaking plans and putting into practice what you learned at the conference last year and the year before, we have these spotlight webinar examples on different topics that we've experienced or discussed or learned more about to keep your momentum going. So as you develop your plans, remember on our Rural Placemaking Toolkit, you can visit and you can upload examples of successful projects you've been doing so that we could add you and feature you as well. I'm especially excited today to be able to showcase the Waymakers Collective. I live in the region where they work in Appalachia, and I can say firsthand that I've gotten to witness some of the amazing examples of grant making that they have used and implemented in our region. What really, really stands out to me is the way that they make grant making accessible. I know a lot of you, when you've attended our conference in the past and we've had panels on how to get grants, that can be sometimes the most confusing step and the most challenging process. You have a great idea, you have great people ready to work, but how do you get the money to pull it off? Because even if grants are available, sometimes the application process has so many barriers and obstacles in the way that it makes it really, really difficult to secure that funding. Through our partnership with USDA, we've really enjoyed hearing about a lot of the different rural placemaking initiatives, but it's also a priority to us that we spotlight those examples of people who are doing grant making differently, not only for you to hear about it, but in the hopes that your community leaders or other philanthropic organizations that join these calls will say, hey, this is the way that we should be engaging in our communities as well. So I would love to tell you about the Waymakers Collective. As Jackie mentioned, they're radical grant makers. They're here in the heart of Appalachia, and they work from their own website. They work from the hollers to the cities. And joining us today is Joe Tolbert Jr. He's the executive director of the Waymakers Collective. And we also have a grantee that's received funds from Waymakers who will be able to share about their work. I'm excited for you all on the call to hear all the ways that Waymakers Collective is approaching grant making and creative placemaking in Appalachia. So I won't continue speaking right now. I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Executive Director Tolbert, take it away.
I was on mute. You think I would know better by now. Thank you, Melissa, and everyone for inviting us to speak. We're really just excited to be able to share our model and how we came to be. And so I would first like to ground us in our vision. So we strive to sustain creative practice, land, livelihoods, and dialogue across neighborhoods and disciplines. We envision an Appalachia that supports the joy, imagination, and hopes of our artists, activists, and culture bearers. We sustain community organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, young people, LGBTQ folks, non-English speakers, new immigrants, and those unlikely to receive mainstream funding. And so I wanted to just ground you all in our vision because that is the future that we want to implement. And we know that the future is influenced by what we do today. And so we're really trying to live into this vision now so that we can create different pathways in our future. So I wanted to begin with our origin story because I think it's important to also highlight Art Place America. So Art Place America was one of the big leaders in trying to disrupt how creative placemaking was thought about. And they really innovated the grant making process for creative placemaking initiatives across the country. However, there were some disparities in their funding, Appalachia being one of them. And so to remedy this, they knew that they were going to sunset in 2020. That was always a part of their plan. However, they knew that there were places that they didn't do their due diligence to get money to. And so they created the Local Control Local Fields Initiative, which gathered assemblies in various places across the country to allow the communities themselves to determine what to do with these investments that were coming to these locations across the country. And Central Appalachia was one of those places. And so the process gathered about 30 or 32 community members, activists, funders, people from different sectors to dream together and come up with what would happen with the $4.5 million initial investment that we were going to receive. And so not only did they convene us, but they also supported us with facilitators from our region who knew the area, the people involved in the field, to also move us through a process. And so the goal of these gatherings, were to identify what the field of creative placemaking was in all its varied places, because we were one of the largest geographic regions in the local control local fields initiative, because as you know, we span 5 states. And so that was one of the biggest things, was what is creative placemaking in West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina. And that brought its own tension. And so we were also learning what it means to work more democratically and allow all voices to be heard. And so I want to just track that too, because that is also a part of the learning, and you'll see how that influenced the shape that we took. And so once we identified what the field was, we started thinking about, well, what are the things that people don't fund? And what are the things that we know what I call capital P philanthropy often falls short on when dealing with our communities in Appalachia? And so we took all of that into account over that year and came up with our funding priorities. Uh-oh. There we go. And so throughout that process, we had all of this data. I mean, it was flip chart paper everywhere, notebooks and things typed up. And so we had to distill that down, and we distilled that down to our 5 strategies. And so we felt that it was important to give direct support to artists and communities, because one of the hardest things is for individual artists who aren't attached to organizations and 501c3s to be able to get money. And so we wanted to take that barrier away and give direct support to both the organizations that empower the communities, but also the individual artists who may be working independent of 501c3 organizations. And the second one is using arts and culture to heal and restore. We know that Central Appalachia as a region has faced a lot of extractive industries that are used in the name of jobs, and that oftentimes that puts communities at odds with each other. And so we talked a lot about how the arts and culture organizations and the sector writ large can use what they do to bring that healing and those community conversations, and also how that can restore not just people and communities, but also lead to restoration of the land. And so the third point, developing cross-region networking. Again, you know, people of our region is one of our greatest assets. And so we know that money is important. Let's be clear, money and the grant dollars are important, but also the knowledge that people hold and that earned wisdom is also a resource. But in order to leverage that earned wisdom that so many of us hold who have been doing this work, we have to be networked together. And so we also want to support the work of developing cross-region networking, so that if I don't know, I know that I have a place to go to access the knowledge that people may hold that can help me with whatever I may not know and be struggling with. And so reviving and developing infrastructure. This was an important one. And I remember when I brought this up in the larger assembly process, one of the things that I was wanting to bring to light is that a lot of people don't fund things like building repair, and that a lot of the Black cultural institutions that hold the history and the memory, like their buildings were in disrepair, and they didn't know what they were going to do, because oftentimes as you all may know, there's a lot of project support, but there's not a lot of support for the maintenance and the upkeep of the buildings in which the programming happens, because if they don't have a place to hold the programming, it'll make it difficult to hold it. And so we wanted to be sure to also support that work, because a lot of our organizations also have buildings, and those buildings need upkeep and repair. And so our fourth strategy was the reviving and developing infrastructure. And one of the biggest things that has come to light is highlighting what it truly means to be Appalachian in this moment and what it means to be a creative in Appalachia. And so we wanted to also focus our strategy on shifting the narrative about what it means to live, create, and work in Appalachia. And I think this fifth bullet point is so important, because we know that our region becomes the scapegoat of a lot of different narratives that float around at the national level. But we are here to say that we are working together to build a more inclusive place, a more creative place that supports the thriving of all the diverse populations of people who live and work in Appalachia. So shifting the narrative is our fifth strategy that we came up with during that initial local control, local fields initiative. All right, and so a lot of people find our structure really interesting, because it is not traditional at all. And that was intentionally so, because what came out of the local control, local fields process is, what would it be to have a arts union? And as you can imagine, once we start looking into how that could work, it quickly got too legally complicated. And so we were like, how can we keep things like democratic control and collective ownership at the core of our process? And so in 2020, we instituted a transition team, because there needed to be some transitionary body from that initial third. They instituted our nomination process, where each of us who were original assembly members got to vote and nominate 3 people in our community that was doing good work. And so that is one of the core tenets of our process, because a lot of times, you know, philanthropy doesn't get as deep into the work that's happening on the ground. And so we were like, nobody knows the community like the people in it. And so what would it be to turn to those people to say who are doing amazing work that needs to be supported? And so we all got to nominate 3 people. And then we took those nominations, and the transition team invited people to apply. And it was very simple. We only asked for what we needed. And that continues through our current grant making of not putting barriers, because we know that some places in our region still struggles to get reliable broadband. And so how can we do this work in a way that honors the realities on the ground? And so from that, once people are nominated, whether they receive funding or not, they can opt into voting membership. And what voting membership allows is for them to act as members of our board of directors. So every voting member, and we have around 130, 150 voting members currently, because not everybody opts into it. Some people just want that initial support, and that's it, right? But for those who do opt into voting membership, those are our board of directors, and those are the folks that vote on the different directions that we can take. And they also get access to continued funding, while also being able to nominate the people in their community, so they can extend that nomination to folks. And that kind of allows us to grow in a sustainable manner and not get too big too fast. And those voting members can also serve on the Apple Corps, and the Appalachian Corps is voted on every year. from our voting members to act as the steering committee. And so they work more closely alongside me and the other staff of our fiscal sponsor to move the work forward. And there are expectations to work up to 5 to 10 hours a week, but we also want to institute that the creative labor that steering committees often extract should be compensated. And so for those people who serve on Apple Corps, they also that they spend and the work that they put into making our programs work. And so they get a $20,000 grant for up to 3 years of service. And then we rotate those people off and bring new people in from the voting membership. And I would say the outermost ring is philanthropic collaborators. You know, this work doesn't happen in isolation. And so we know that back in the 2019 process that ArtPlace guided us through, we knew that we didn't want to sunset because some of the assemblies in other parts of the country did decide just to disperse the funds and then sunset. We knew that the most revolutionary thing for us in our region would be to continue to try and raise funds so that our community can hold the funds and distribute them in ways that the community knows it's needed. And so we do see philanthropic collaborators as more than just places to go to raise additional funds, but also what are the things that our voting members and larger communities should be reading and studying about how philanthropy works. And so being in dialogue with our philanthropic collaborators beyond fundraising is also core as we build out our learning community, which goes to that support that we are trying to offer beyond just grant dollars. And so if we can stop the share for a minute, I do want to just talk about some other parts of our work and the pathways that it's creating. So one of the things that I didn't make a slide about that I also just wanted to mention is that we also saw that the money that we hold, that we also wanted to put it to use right before we give it away in grant dollars. And so we do impact investing. And so we have an impact investment with FAHI, the Federation of Appalachian Housing Enterprises, that is a CDFI that gives money to people who are building affordable housing in our region. And we also have another impact investment with OWISTA, which is a Native American CDFI that supports Native business owners, creatives. And so we are also a part of this work is how can we put all of the funds that we hold in values aligned investments so that we can support the work of other people who are supporting the work in our region. And so we wanted to do that. And we also recently brought our banking into a values aligned banking system by switching to Amalgamated Bank, which is one of the nation's oldest cooperative ran banking institutions. And so that is also important to us, is to make sure that we're not investing in things like private prisons and extractive industries that have so harmed our region. And what we are seeing now is a lot of opportunities to deepen relationships with the indigenous community and immigrant communities. And so we're exploring what would it mean to support land back issues, for example, or ways that we can support the immigrant populations in our region. And so, yeah, those are some things that are on the horizon that the voting membership will be working through in our upcoming voting members meeting to kind of set some vision and priorities for our continued work But thank you all for allowing me to share. And our grantee, the bottom, which I'm happy that I was able to nominate during that first round of funding. The director, Khalil White, couldn't be with us, but she did record the presentation. And once you all hear about the amazing work, y'all are gonna fall in love like I did when they first started working in my hometown community. So be inspired by Khalil White and the work of the bottom, because they're doing amazing things. Thank you all.
My name is Khalil White, and I am the executive director of The Bottom. We are a nonprofit community space and bookstore located in Knoxville, Tennessee. We're also a Waymaker grantee, and I am also an Apple Corps member of through Waymakers. So I'm going to just talk about a little bit about our organization and about how we got involved with the Waymakers organization, and the support that we receive from them. So The Bottom, we are a community space located in Knoxville, Tennessee, but we're focused in community, culture, and creativity for Black Knoxvillians. So The Bottom was founded in 2020 by our founding director, Dr. Nkechi Elamine. She's a local sociologist, and she was studying placemaking, race, and Black communities in Knoxville, Tennessee. And through her work, she was able to uncover the Bottom community. And it was a Black neighborhood in East Knoxville that was destroyed in the early 1950s during urban renewal. So doing her research, talking with a lot of the residents in that community, she realized that a lot of that history was not being archived in Knoxville's archival history about communities, about placemaking, and she felt was so important to not only archive this history, but to reclaim that space and what was stolen from that community, that the just the kinship there, the culture and the creativity that was there. She wanted to reimagine that in a space in Knoxville. So that is how The Bottom was born, through that. And through our big C's, community, culture, and creativity, we keep that in the heart of everything that we do, knowing that it was so important to have that space and deeply rooted in community building. So we do a lot of programming throughout the year, but most of our focus, as you can see in this image, is our bookstore. We have our Black bookstore with a lot of Black affirming stories and selections from Black authors about Black experiences. We wanted to make sure that what the community sees is not just trauma and turmoil and the stories and literature that we have around us. So we wanted to capture everything that is our community and what we see. But with that, we also realize that art is a big part of our culture and creativity as Black people. So we do that with providing workshops free to our community so that they can use it, whether they are using our podcast studio, our multicultural art space, sewing, doing ceramics, or any of our Black creatives meetup programs that we have throughout the year, just to really invite everyone in to be in this space for community and culture and creativity. But being a grantee, we started being a grantee, I want to say, in 2021. We started out with Appalachian Community Fund is how we found out about the Waymakers Collective. And doing a couple of the fellowships through ACF, we were invited to be a grantee, selected to receive some grant funds from the Waymakers Collective. And from there, we've used that to reimagine the way that we connect with our community through our programming and through the workshops and literature that we have in the space. So from the financial backing that we receive from Waymakers, we've been able to do the free workshops. We've been able to provide author talks and a lot of different literature workshops in the space, but also providing our books to our community at low cost. Has been a big thing, especially with we're seeing a lot of the ban book legislation and things around a lot of our stories that is being depicted by others. So wanted to make sure that the stories coming from our community is reflective of things that we experience. But also the culture and creativity is so prominent in our community, and making sure that we have that accessible to our community is so important. And through our connection and our support from the Waymakers Collective, we've been able to not only provide this for the community, but keep this going and be able to fund more creative outlets for the community. But also, additionally, with these funds, this has allowed us to compensate the Black women in our community. We are a Black woman-led organization, and we want to make sure that we're paying the women that work with us equitably. And through the financial backing from the Waymakers Collective, it has been possible for us to provide that. I say one of the things that we have found very difficult with a lot of other funding sources in collectives is that there's not a lot that is focused on unrestricted funds for nonprofit organizations, especially for small grassroots organizations. Having unrestricted funds to not only fund our creative workshops and literature, but also to pay our staff and to make sure that we can be sustainable in this environment that we're in the nonprofit world is so important. And we're definitely grateful for having that connection with them. And also, I would say having that network of other nonprofits in the region to be able to understand how they're operating, to have these partnerships and these connections, to discuss what works, what didn't work, to have backing if we need fundraising efforts for our different programs that we have throughout the year has been a very pivotal part of our association with the Waymakers Collective. um, Definitely would not replace it for the world, and I'm very grateful that we have them in our corner. But like I said again, we are the Bottom Knox. We're located in Knoxville, Tennessee, um, and I'm definitely grateful for this partnership with the Waymakers Collective and everything else that they can provide for us through the networks, through the workshops that we provide, but also the workshops that they give us to be a nonprofit and understanding the intricacies of having a nonprofit, the logistics of paperwork, the legal standings, but also how to fundraise and how to have a board. They have provided us with so many things that I think it would have been so much harder for us starting out without that support and backing from the Waymakers Collective. So I'm definitely very appreciative for that relationship. And that is all that I have up today. And thank you.
The two facilitators that Art Place hired for us was Tanya Torp and Thomas Watson, who was at the time, I believe, still running his company, Rural Support Partners. And I feel like that was one of the best decisions that Art Place made in their process, because again, this was replicated in many different communities across the country. And I think what that allowed was for us to address tensions, because we had to wade through the tensions, because, you know, like the way philanthropy works, it breeds scarcity mindset. And when you're working with populations who are already under-resourced, it's just like that confirmation of, oh, there will never be enough. So let us like do the whole competition thing. And so there were people who were like, you know, so-and-so did this to me in a community meeting. So I feel like because the facilitators were from the region, they provided ways for us to get through that much quicker. And so that was a lot of what the beginning part of the process was, addressing the elephants in the room, the power imbalances between who were funders, not funders, that whole thing. And so that's what a lot of the first part was. And then they just allowed us to dream. Like, what would you do with this $4.5 million? And allowed each of us to sit in reflection, in conversation, and we all got to stand up and say, this is what I do with this money. And from that, they built off of that and kind of figured out where the synergy points were and pushed us further to kind of keep going and keep going. And I think that is what we should be doing more of in these creative placemaking, is just allowing people to dream first, because we're so about the deliverables and getting right to the business at hand. And there's oftentimes not built into the process places for us to dream. And that dreaming is what gave us all the data that then a group was selected from the larger group to meet a little more frequently than the all-together meetings, and kind of refine that to those 5 strategies. And then we had to talk about governance, and that was another big sticky point. Some people were for the artist union, some people were for putting the money in more traditionally funded organizations, or what I like to call the regional darlings. And so again, there was that real tension there, but again, the facilitators were so skillful at moving us through it to where we were able to make the decision to riff off of a cooperative, even though we couldn't like officially become one. And that's how we got to our structure. And once the governance model was chosen, we then had to pick where the money would live. And we chose Appalachian Community Fund because of their long-standing support of radical work happening in our region. And so once that final decision was made, the funds were transferred in 2020.
I think that's so, it's very inspiring to hear, in a way that a lot of organizations, when they're forming, they're really in that honeymoon period for the first year or two. And it's not until situations arise that they start to hash out those different layers. So what I think is really significant to the sustainability of Waymakers is it sounds like you had a lot of those hard conversations in the beginning, but in a meaningful way where you were given different scenarios and then really thinking through what are the outcomes of this, what are the results of that, what might be consequences here or there. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of us, no matter what level we're at in our placemaking efforts, even if it's project-based, it sounds like taking the time to build that team, allow everyone to be heard, even if maybe that their idea is not the direction that's taken, can really support the longevity of the organization.
And I think that's important because it challenges the ways that we're taught to work with each other, right? Because in this creative placemaking philanthropy field, you know, there are real power imbalances with community members and like the people who are the people to like drive the process. And so I think that's what is also important about this. And I alluded to it earlier, but a lot of people think that the process was like unicorns and rainbows, but it wasn't. We had some real challenges, and most of it revolved around people who were used to being the ones who had all the power to kind of like get their way and decisions made in alignment with what they needed. And so I think that's what I'm learning, is when you bring a diverse group of people, you also have to like set the stage of how people are going to work together, because that is what has allowed us to continue the work, is knowing how to navigate differences, because we talk about diversity all the time, but when people are in the room, so are their histories, so are their cultures. And when it all clashes in the container, you have to know what to do. And I feel like that was a big part of the learning for me back in that initial process as a person who's used to working for under-resourced Black arts organizations. How do I step into this power in a place where I'm not often allowed to have it in these philanthropic spaces? And so resetting the terms of engagement to where everybody is on equal playing field, I think was one of the biggest things that I learned from that, and that I would recommend, because it allows you that input from everyone in a very different way.
I love that you're talking about I think any of us in all of our communities can think of those people who typically hold the power, and when they're in the room, everyone looks to them to follow their decision making. And I love that you all were very intentional about decentralizing that, We are getting some questions kind of around the way that you support those not smaller, but less known artists or entrepreneurs who are just starting out, and they maybe have an idea, but they've never been in that position of power to leverage to be able to pull it off. What are ways that you're supporting those smaller or just starting out groups or agencies?
Choosing to fund them. I mean, quite simply. And the thing that I also want to highlight that Khalil mentioned is funding them in unrestricted funds. So we don't dictate how they use it. You know, we had one person submit a grant about one thing, but then their car broke down and they were a musician and needed to move around to get to their gigs. That was the source of their income. And so we got an email that was like, thank you for letting me use this grant to fix my car, because now I can have reliable transportation to get to my gigs. And so I think that unrestricted support is very big, because if people who are creatives and artists can get their basic needs met, then that only goes back into the art, because they're not stressing or having to work other jobs that takes away from their creative practice. And so I think that's one of the big ways. And then again, we started our learning community this year. And so we kind of started with very like simple topics, right? You know, around storytelling, both how do we tell our stories of our practice, our organization? How do we do that through grant writing? You know, how do we archive our community stories? And so now that we've kind of gotten that going, and we'll have our next session, those are open to the public. And so we also know that even though we're trying to do philanthropy differently, one of the things that capital P philanthropy does is privilege people over people. And so we acknowledge that that unfortunately is inherent in this voting member, non-member model that we've created. And so we've been intentional to try and find ways to support people with knowledge as a pathway to getting nominated and into the work of the collective. And so our annual gathering and these learning community gatherings are open to the public so that people can have like a low entry level into our work. And so again, it's like the grant dollars, yes, but also sometimes just being in a room with people who know the things that you need answers to is also a different form of support that we try to offer as well.
With so many voting members, I'm sure there's times where there are disagreements or deliberations that are ongoing throughout the growth of your organization. What are some strategies you all use to manage that, or to hold space for those conversations as your voting body grows?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be transparent and say that we are just now at the point where we're starting to truly live into it, because it's like you have a thing in theory and you think a thing in your head, and then you try to do the thing and you're like, oh, this thing needs to be considered. And so I feel like that was so much of what 2022 was about, is just like getting some basic organizational foundations in place. And so now where we're at in our growth is, what do people need to know so that they can feel empowered to step into a decision-making role? And so that's kind of where we are at the moment, because again, philanthropy has kind of held this mystified aura and like mystique that isn't always welcoming to people who aren't already in those conversations and circles, because I didn't even see myself in philanthropy until I was invited to that initial 2019 assembly process. And so what we're seeing is that people are really shameful for the things that were intentionally kept from them. And so we can't even get to the democratic voting part yet. because we are having to like teach them about philanthropy and the history of it and why what we're doing is political and the politics of it all. And so we're engaging in that part. But for me, I see myself as a steward, even though I have like the ED title. And so for me, it's about slowing down processes, right? And allowing true conversation to happen. Because again, I think we get so caught up on deliverables and, you know, the product or the outcomes that we don't allow for the true conversations. And oftentimes the conflict is a conflict because like people are talking past each other oftentimes. And so for me, one thing that I always try to remind us is that we're humans, not robots, and that we can actually slow down and do this work in a way that allows for us to center our humanity in conversations and not penalizing people for information that has been systemically kept from them. And so allowing for the process to slow down so that people can actually learn by doing. Because I'm quick to tell them all the time, I've been learning a lot since 2019, and if I can learn it, you can too. And so not recreating those hierarchies and leveling the playing field so that people can feel empowered to ask their questions or pausing something that's moving too fast so that the conflicts can be addressed. And so I think that's something that has been demonstrated throughout the entirety of our process from 2019 to now. And so I'm determined to kind of keep that at the core and slowing down and building containers for conversation to happen.
I love that there's such a dedicated focus on equipping your members or people who attend your workshops that you have open to anyone on just some of the basics around the world of philanthropy and funding, because it is so nebulous and it is such a gatekeeping entity as a whole sometimes that if you don't know the lingo, you can't even get your foot in the door. So I think there's such a holistic approach here to not just placemaking work or arts work, but building up the whole person and all of their skill sets that might intersect between all of this. Sorry, go ahead.
Just say one thing about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we narrow down what culture is to just art making. And I think that misses all of the other ways that culture is being leveraged or can be leveraged in creative placemaking, because I love the cultural iceberg model so much. And it basically talks about surface culture and deep culture. And surface culture are things like style of dress, food, language, art making. But then once you look at deep culture, it's like decision making, thoughts around gender and gender roles. And those are like the deep cultural things. And I think the power of creative placemaking is that the process of creating a place and creating culture, like the bottom, is also like getting at some of those deeper things and undoing those. And so, yeah, taking that expansive view of culture allows us to get at some of the things that leads to the cohesion of a place in the processes of being creative and doing these creative things in community.
I love that it's the opposite of a soundbite approach. We've gotten too comfortable describing regions or people or places with just a tagline or a marketing tool, and I love that it's so broad and it recognizes, especially you sharing the iceberg model of thinking about deep culture, and I think that's critical. We're getting a lot of questions both from people in the region who want to know how they can get involved more and have a role, and then also people from outside the region who are just asking about general resources or how they can also learn more.
Yeah, so people in the region. So we do work within Central Appalachia, and that's Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, Western North Carolina, West Virginia. And so that's kind of our service area. And I would just say, again, we have those two opportunities that are open to the public, and those are ways for us to get to know you, for you to get to know us, because we really do live into more trust-based philanthropy models. And so that's a very easy way. Just a second, my computer is trying to update right in the middle of this call. And that's an easy way. And our next learning community session happens on the 18th of September, and it's going to be with Will Isom of the Black in Appalachia Project, talking about archiving community stories. And so that's also a way just to see who some of the people are. Will was one of our original assembly members with me back in 2019. And so that's, yeah, that's the way. It's just, and then the other thing that's open to the public is our annual gathering that just happened in Eastern Kentucky. And so that's a yearly thing, and it's like the in-person version of what we are trying to recreate online. And so that's another way. And so again, we do live into the trust-based philanthropy. And so I think that is one thing that is troublesome to people, is that we really do move at the speed of trust and getting to know each other. And so we invite you to come to our learning community gatherings and our annual conference next year.
Thank you. We have someone wanting to know, if you don't know off the top of your head, it's okay, but they're curious, how many organizations or groups have you all funded?
Oof. In the process of writing our impact report from 2020 to now, and I want to say that we are at maybe like 130 or a little less than 130 of organizations and individuals, because we do fund individuals. And so in that number, it's a mixture of both organizations and individuals.
That's amazing. We have one final question, and then we're already out of time, but I've loved getting to talk with you. I feel like if I could, I would keep asking you questions all day, and I think a lot of these folks would stay on as well. But how, if there are any other philanthropic organizations on this call and they're interested in doing grant making differently, how would you pitch to them to understand the value of unrestricted funds?
I mean, just the world is requiring so much of us as individuals, that unrestricted funds kind of opens up the impact that people can have and philanthropic organizations can have, because it's allowing people to self-determine. And I think that's a big thing that we believe, is that our impact is greater when the people who we support can determine how best to use the funds that we are trying to give them. And I would also say, just beyond the unrestricted funds, just getting to know the people and getting that feedback loop, because it's a pain to like institute that in processes, but the information you learn is like truly invaluable to determine what are the best interventions, in addition to that unrestricted grant dollars. And so that could be the ways that the application is set up, or, you know, kind of thinking about, am I asking for more than what I actually need for bookkeeping and those kinds of things. And so I would just say being open to information from the people and the communities you all serve can lead to far greater benefits in allowing you to meet them where they are.
Thank you so much. I completely agree with you. And that's there's so many innovative things you all are doing, and just breaking so many barriers all the way around. And for everyone that's interested in learning more, The links that are in the chat will get those out to you. Also, this session has been recorded, so you'll be able to watch this. If I saw a few people say they've got to join late and they want to catch the beginning, so this will be sent out to you all. Please check out Waymakers Collective website, because that has all the information you need to ask more questions or learn more information. And we thank you all so much for joining us in this quarterly webinar. Thank you, Joe, so much for sharing the wonderful work you all are doing at Appalachia. And I really hope that our other organizations on here will look to you as a model to really break down the barriers that we have.
Thanks for having me.
Just to wrap up, so some final information for all of you on the webinar. We're going to continue these quarterly webinars. So keep an eye out to the listserv to be able to learn about the next one that we'll have, including the date and how to register. Make sure to check out our sessions on YouTube if you missed our annual conference. Those are available on the SETIC YouTube channel. And we're all looking forward to the next time that we gather together and feature someone else to showcase their placemaking work in rural America. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.